Good afternoon and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator at Gibson's Bookstore. I am very pleased to welcome this afternoon 5 middle grade and young adult authors. We have, wave as I name you, Josh Roberts, The Witches of Willow Cove. We have Lorien Lawrence, who wrote The Stitchers, Kat Scully, who wrote Jennifer Strange, Kaela Noel, author of Coup, and Cathleen Barnhart, That's What Friends Do. Thank you so much for joining us. I will mention that all of these books are available from Gibson's Bookstore, and we do happily ship or offer curbside pickup service. We are also currently open for limited browsing. Hello to all of you. Welcome. Thank you for joining me this afternoon for this discussion. How are you guys doing? Tell me a little bit about your books.
Sorry, Josh, go.
I'll go first. I'll go first. So this is my book. This is The Witches of Willow Cove. It's a upper middle grade contemporary fantasy, spooky adventure, mystery, suspense, thriller kind of book. It defies description. Now, I always say that I got the idea for my book because I grew up in a small New England town with that I didn't realize had these sort of connections to Salem, Massachusetts. And it had this sort of secret history. And I started asking questions as well, like, well, what would happen if you grew up in a small town with a secret history and then discovered that you had connections to it? And it sort of, the question sort of led to other questions, and I ended up coming up with a story where these kids discovered that they were related to the sort of secret history connected to the Salem witch trials. And from that, a story grew in scale and scope, and that's how I arrived at The Witches of Willow Cove.
I'll go because I'm another spooky middle grade author. I'm Lorien Lawrence. I wrote The Stitchers, which is the first book in the Fright Watch series. The second one is coming out next fall. It follows Quinn Parker, who's a 13-year-old runner, and she starts to uncover on her morning runs that like something super weird is up with her neighbors. They don't ever seem to age. And so she enlists her friend Mike, who's also on the track team, and together they kind of uncover, what's really going on with the oldies, as they call them. And what they end up uncovering is way more creepy than what they ever thought. So it's perfect book for kids who like adventure, mystery, supernatural, especially this time of year. And you hear my children.
And hi, I'm Kat Scully. I wrote Jennifer Strange. I also did creepy, but I'm younger YA. So my book is for readers, they're middle grade or young, like around 15, 16, who are just getting out of middle grade and want to look into doing YA books, but might not be ready for, say, Stephen King level or upper YA horror. It's about a girl who is completely estranged from her older sister after their mom dies, named Jennifer, and she gets this power where she can give ghosts and demons a body with the touch of her hand. And she doesn't know exactly why she has this power or what's going on, and her dad, the only way he explains is by handing her a journal and saying, here's the explanation. I have to go try and stop this from spreading and from your power getting worse. Stay with your older sister. I'll be back in 3 days. Bye. And she gets stuck in Savannah, Georgia. And she and her sister haven't spoken, her older sister Liz haven't spoken for years. And they have to figure out why they have this hereditary power and what to do about it. And when their dad goes missing longer than he says he is supposed to be gone, they have to go find him. So that's Jennifer Strange. It's the first in the trilogy. I'm really excited to have the first book out, and then we're going to do 2 more. And I'm so excited about the series and to be on this panel with these incredible authors.
So the book I wrote, That's What Friends Do, has no supernatural or scary elements in it. It's realistic fiction. It is the story of a 7th grade girl's first Me Too experience. And it is told in alternating points of view by the girl, Sammy, and her best friend, David. who's on the other side of that experience. And it's the misunderstandings and miscommunications that lead to this moment. And then the work that they both have to do to repair their friendship and to for Sammy to find her voice and be able to talk about what has happened.
I think I'm the last one. I like Kathleen's, my book. Well, my book is not spooky. It is a younger middle grade book about a girl who is abandoned next to an empty roof, and she's rescued as an infant by a flock of pigeons who then care for her until she's about 10. And the pigeon that she's closest to is injured by a hawk. She has to seek help, and she meets a local pigeon healer, animal rescuer lady named Tully, who ends up adopting her. And the book is about her experiences navigating the human world for the first time, and also what she has to do after she discovers that all the pigeons in the city are under threat. So it's like a fairy tale.
So all three of you write books for young persons. Can any of you describe how you think of the difference between upper middle grade and young adult? And why is upper middle grade, why do you think it's experiencing such a resurgence right now in publishing? Lorien, maybe we'll start with you.
I was hoping you'd call on me because I'm a 7th grade English teacher, and I mean, for the second part of your question, as a 7th grade English teacher, I am with 12 to 13-year-olds. And last year I taught 8th grade as well with 14-year-olds, and there's not a lot out there for them that is about kids their age who actually act the way real kids that age act. A lot of the middle grade about kids who are 12 and 13 is younger in voice because it's meant for kids who are younger than those ages. And then YA is quite adult, especially in the kinds of category that I write in where it gets spooky and supernatural. I wouldn't really feel comfortable giving YA horror to my 7th grade students. And so I'm personally thrilled, and so are my students, that there is this kind of surgence of upper middle grade kind of coming in, and that these stories echo things that they're actually feeling and experiencing. I'll pass it to someone else.
Kathleen, what are your thoughts?
So like Lorien, I think that there are topics and issues that upper middle grade, 7th and 8th grade kids are ready for, but they're not necessarily ready for the darkness of a lot of YA. So I think YA has gotten, in some ways, has gotten darker and more, maybe more real, but more sort of just a lot of hard stuff in YA, which maybe is good for older kids, but I think for those upper middle grade kids, a lot of YA is just too dark. It's got too much in it that's scary, that's overwhelming, but they're ready to think about some more complex issues, just without, I think, some of the darkness.
If I can jump in, I think for me, as I look at what I liked to read at that age, and then also as my children, my daughter is 11 and my son is 13, so they're right in that area as well. And I always liked these sort of complex, really interesting long form stories that I think the younger middle grade, you're really constrained to a particular word count, whereas with upper middle grade and lower YA, you can expand the story a little bit more. You can kind of take some twists and turns. And I found, when I was writing, that I felt more sort of liberated to explore the story and go in depth with the mystery and do more twists and turns. And I think also that when you just look at publishing, the way publishers have pushed it, it's really, 8 to 12 is middle grade and 16 to 18 is young adult. And there has just been this big gap for characters and also readers in that middle area. And it makes sense, because where exactly do you put it on the bookshelf? Like, which do you put it in middle grade? Do you put it in young adult? There isn't this sort of traditional in between. But, when I think back to also, again, when I was a kid, there wasn't quite the same segmentation. As a kid, I read stories about adults. I read stories about superheroes in their 20s and 30s. I watched movies where the main characters were adults. And it wasn't quite as much of put this into a box and this is the age group that you have to read about and this is the types of stories you have to read. So I think as publishing is sort of expanding and we're getting this freedom to explore this whole in-between age, when really, the issues that you care about at 12, 13, 14, 15 are significantly different than the issues you care about when you're 8, 9, 10, 11. And they're also different than what you care about when you're, in that upper teenage range. So I think there's just so much freedom and so much opportunity to write about things that have been a significant gap in books for kids that age. Because, not to dominate this entire answer, but one more thing I was thinking is that, when the Harry Potter books came out, they created this bridge of start when Harry's 11 and end when he's 18, and you follow him all the way through and his friends, and you do see that the characters change and the things that they care about change. And I think that sort of paved the way for this upper middle grade thing, because you were getting this crossover reading from different ages, reading all those different books.
I completely agree with what they've all said. And I used to be, several years ago, the young adult editor for the Horror Writers Association. And I did a lot of panels, I did a lot of signings, I worked with not just young adult, but middle grade. And I kept getting the parents of readers coming and asking, where are the books that I have a kid who's a horror fan and they're 12, they're 13, they're 15, but they're not quite ready for the themes of YA, and YA typically tends to be 17-year-old, 18-year-old that's going through, I'm about to go to college, which is very different from, I've just left middle school, what even is high school? What does it mean to be not just a part of my neighborhood, but a part of my community? What does the larger world look like? What do I want to do with my life? Who am I? All those kinds of identity questions. And that was the biggest transitional part of my teenage years, was being in the 9th grade. And I got taken out of a high school where I was one of 900 freshmen to this very small math science high school where I had to wear a uniform. And I didn't know what high school was supposed to look like. I just gotten out of 8th grade. I hadn't been able to drive a car yet, but I was expected to be more adult. And it was this age I was reading YA after YA horror book and going, where are the books that are about the 9th graders, about the 10th graders, who they can't drive, but they have more freedom, they have more, I need to know who I am, they have more expected of them. And I went into writing Jennifer Strange thinking, okay, I want to show this age where you're both expected to make decisions, but you don't know how to make them yet, where you're trying to figure out holding your first job and also I don't know, where am I going? What am I doing? Life used to be a lot more simple kind of in middle school. Now it's exploded into this bigger thing. And suddenly I'm thinking, I'm pressured into what my major is going to be in college, and I don't even know what I want in my life. And and I felt like there's this surplus of readers who are asking for these books. I was also a bookseller at Barnes & Noble, and I kept getting asked, where are these that aren't, so they don't leap into Stephen King. They don't jump, from I'm reading R.L. Stein, now Stephen King. And I wanted to add to that narrative that would have something transitional where you could get some real scares, but the adult themes that are from 18, 19, 20, where you're thinking about completely different life problems, were missing, and it focused more on family, found family, sisterhood, brotherhood. What does it mean to be a good friend? What does it mean to start going out on your own without your parents and making decisions? And I just really wanted to do something in that vein. And it's so wonderful to meet others who saw this need and felt the same way and wanted to add to it. And it's just been so encouraging to me, like, yes, I really did see this. Other people are trying to add into with their voices. And I'm so glad, because there are a lot of readers that need these books.
I think, Kaela, I think you might be the last to answer this one.
Yeah, and I think I'm the only one whose character is significantly younger. She's 10 or 11. It's never quite clear in the book. But the book that I'm working on right now, my work in progress, which I just turned in to my editor, so I'm waiting to hear back what she thinks of it, is possibly going to be more upper middle grade. Right now, the protagonist is 12 going on 13, but she's definitely dealing with a lot of the issues that Kat just mentioned, where it's really figuring out friendships and her place in her family and her independence and what it means to realize that what you do with the independence that you're given as you get older. And there is like a big gap, I feel like, between that kind of the sort of wider expectations around a character who's 10 or 11 years old, or, you know, in the way that sometimes, I forget who it was, if it was Kathleen or Lorien, who was talking about how sometimes characters will be 12 or 13. It was Lorien, but she knows from teaching that that's not actually how 7th and 8th graders talk or speak in the real world. So it's meant for kids who are 9 and 10. But there's just such a difference in the atmosphere of books where the 12 and 13-year-olds or 14-year-olds are acting like they actually act in real life. So I'm trying to figure that out right now. And I might age the voice back down, just because when you, it's a really hard thing to write, like an upper middle grade book. I think that's part of why there are fewer in the market, even though there's so much need, is because it really requires a lot of skill to nail it. And I'm interested, I like reading those books. I think they're very hard to write well.
I found, for me, when I sat down, I didn't have a preconceived notion of what I was going to write. And I gravitated to that age. So my character, Abby Shepherd, is the main character in The Witches of Willow Cove, and it opens on her 13th birthday. And there's actually a line in the first chapter where she hasn't turned 13 yet. She was still 12, and I was like, oh, maybe this will let me like pass this off as middle grade instead of upper middle grade. But I found, like, and my other main character, his name is Robbie O'Reilly. It's a dual POV story, so it alternates chapters between them. For me, at that age, like, I can still vividly remember being 13, 14 years old. I can connect with the emotions that I had and the very strong feelings, you know, first crushes, feeling independent, feeling sort of like constrained in some ways by age and by, you know, sort of just a lot of things in life, because you have this sense of independence, but you don't have a car, and you do have to be home by, you know, certain time. And so I connected with that, and I still can very vividly remember those feelings. And I found it really sort of enlightening to put that into my writing, and just sort of reconnect with 13, 14-year-old me and just remember what I felt like, and hope that others who are reading it at that age also sort of see themselves in that writing, in those characters.
So at this time, I will remind our audience that if you do have questions for these authors, you are more than welcome to put them in the chat sidebar, and we will get to them during our question time. I'm now going to ask you guys, tell me about how you tackle and balance serious topics in middle grade. I guess we'll start with Kat.
So the serious topics in mine really have to do with the horror of it, like the nature of Jennifer's power. And she's able to give ghosts and demons a body with a touch of her hand, but if it's possessing someone, she can kill the host, which is a very messy power to have. And it was hard to tackle. Okay, what do I do about the scare side of things? Because the rest of it, everything with the sister, everything with her family is pretty, you know, I would say low key. It's more relationships and trying to navigate reconnecting with her sister and healing a bond. But I was definitely struggling with how much scare can I do? How far can I go? And I went back and I referenced my favorite author, like when I was 14, 15, was Paul Zindel, who wrote Locke and Doom and Reef of Death. And his books were middle grade and they got gorier than I'd expect. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do that, but pull back a hair. So I did go and reference other people's books and say, okay, where is the line here? Like, I don't want to go all the way to, say, Clown in the Cornfield, Adam Cesari's, because that's 1718. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I wanted there to be kind of the implication. So I ended up doing it and deciding I'm going to show it, but not explain it. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm not going to be an adult novel because the way I look at the scares of middle grade, young adult, and adult is middle grade is spooky, YA is scary, and adult is terrifying. So I wanted to find this in between spooky and scary because I'm trying to do younger YA. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to imply what she's seeing, but not detail describe it. So I think that was the biggest thing, was tackling how much horror to show versus describe, versus I just ended up relying more on Jennifer's emotional reaction to a very hard scene than go into any amount of detail.
Kathleen, how about you? How do you address and balance and tackle serious topics in middle grade?
So with That's What Friends Do, I was very conscious that because there's this moment where David oversteps boundaries and makes Sammy feel attacked and uncomfortable. I really didn't want my readers to feel that he was a bad kid. I wanted them to be sympathetic. So I was very conscious of trying to write him as a funny character, or a character, a boy who has, is a little bit of a clown or a comic in his life and thinks that way. And I also wanted to do that because I feel that kind of balance is important when you're tackling tough or uncomfortable subjects, that if you can lighten the story with humor or, scenes that are funny, I think it's easier for middle grade readers to get through the story and not get sort of emotionally overwhelmed. So I say all the time, I'm not a funny person in real life. I'm really unable to be, to make jokes or tell funny stories. But because I write, I can take as much time as I need to craft a scene. I can sometimes manage funny in my writing.
Kaela, what are your thoughts?
So I feel like in my book, it was actually a real struggle editing certain parts of my book that dealt with more serious topics. Like in Ku's case, she's abandoned, and there is definitely a tradition in middle grade to have orphans and really terrible parents who abandon their children, and it's hard to strike the right tone outside of fantasy, pure fantasy, in the kind of reality of it. So that was definitely something where I went back and forth a number of times, trying to make sure that it felt real, but wasn't too dark and overwhelming, and had sort of a slightly lighter or more fairy tale-like touch to make it seem just more emotionally manageable. But my book that I'm working on right now deals with really heavy environmental topics, and a phrase that I've heard frequently is ecological grief, which I definitely had as a kid myself when I would hear about things like the Amazon rainforest being destroyed, or closer to home, when I would see areas like farms or forests near my house. This was when we lived for a few years of my childhood in the countryside being redeveloped in really reckless ways, like to put in strip malls and things. And at 8, 9, 10 years old, I would get stomach aches when we drove by places that I remembered that were forests, and I would really worry about the animals that had lived there. And the book I'm working on right now deals with that, and I don't know quite how grim to make it, and it's going to be interesting to see what my editor thinks. I've had different feedback from different writers, other writers who have read it. Some who felt like it could actually be darker, and others who feel like it doesn't need as much description of the actual environmental destruction to make it understandable. But I really would love more books. I read one earlier this year by Amy Sarah King, who's the same person as A.S. King. And it's one of the few middle grade books that I've read that I felt like really dealt with ecological grief really well. It's about a boy who his family's farmland gets sold to become McMansions, and he discovers this creature living there. And it's really good. I highly recommend it. So.
Lorien, how about you? How do you balance heavy and serious themes in your writing?
Well, I'm first fascinated by that term, what was it? Ecological grief? I was that kid who would tell me this counts, but I would stay up and not sleep and just think about whales and all those Save the Whale campaigns. I had a little notebook. Okay, I'm sorry, that's an aside. So how I think I handle, I guess the really tough topic in my book would be grief, which is, as Kaela said, it's quite common for whatever reason in middle grade to have, one parent or a loss of a parent. And again, as a teacher, unfortunately, I see that a lot, a lot of kids who come through my classroom door, they're carrying grief, or they're carrying, divorce, they're carrying a lot of heaviness. And I think in middle grade, another thing that sets it apart from young adult would be hope. You have to kind of have this element of hope and lightness even when things are really, really hard and difficult. And sometimes, like Kathleen, you have to infuse a bit of humor. Like my two main characters, they have a lot of banter, they go back and forth, they're kind of always trying to one up each other. And sometimes I'm purposely doing that to cut through a little bit of the bleakness or the scariness that's happening. And other times it's you gotta leave the reader something to hang on to so that they don't feel, especially right now, man, with everything going on in the world, you gotta give kids something to hold on to, and that has to be hope. So Kaela, I guess for your unsolicited advice for your manuscript right now, I feel like kids, from what I see being a teacher, kids can go dark if you can bring them out of that darkness. And I think that is for what Kat was saying before about, where's the fine line between upper middle grade and younger adult and all those little technical areas. And I really do think the younger the kid is, the more hope they're going to need.
That's an excellent way to put it. You should write an essay where you.
Well, I have no time to do anything. So.
I'm sorry.
Josh, to wrap us up with that question, how do you tackle and balance serious topics in middle grade literature?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost that kids know when they're being talked down to. And it's very important to just be straight and just sort of come at the topic. I think just thinking of my own children, their little radar goes up whenever they see something that's marketed for kids. It's oh, this is the kids' science facts for kids. And they're nope, no thanks. I want to know what's out there. But I agree what Lorien said about hope is important. And humor and banter and pacing, I think for me, I tried to write a book that was really sort of, it takes place over the course of about 5 months, but I tried to make the plot move very quickly. And so you're not leaving them in one particular dark place for too long. You're sort of moving around. And I would say that the sort of difficult topic that the Witches of Willow Cove deals with is something that I think as a country we all are sort of dealing with right now, which is we have this. Sure I understand. Oops, sorry, Siri doesn't understand. We have a complicated history in this country, and we haven't always been good to marginalized people, or really ever. And I think that becomes the history of the small town in the Witches of Willow Cove becomes sort of its own character. Things that were done to unusual women and girls, the way they were treated in, you know, the 16th, 17th, 18th century becomes a major plot point. And it's important, I think, to address that head on, because it really reflects what's still happening in our country to people today. And I think that the way that we deal with that is by giving them a little bit of light. I mean, my story ends with, you know, resolution and hope, but also there's always sort of cutting through the darkness with a little, you know, witty banter or a well-placed joke or something, or even gallows humor, I think, is appropriate. And it's just, I think, important to first and foremost give them a story that's entertaining, and then take them through it and sort of bring them to the other side, as Lorien said.
So to tack on to this question might not be for every one of these authors here, but you did mention grief and other heavy topics. So this age range can be quite tumultuous for the readers. Talk to me about kids using literature to vicariously work through situations in their own life.
I definitely had that in mind. I wanted to tell a story that would be one way of dealing with the situation, that would maybe make kids think, well, what would I do? What if it was me? Who would I talk to? For Sammy, who gets inappropriately touched, she doesn't have anybody to talk to. But it was my hope that readers would think through, well, who would I talk to? Who can I trust? Who would be there for me? Both Sammy and David sort of keep missing each other after the event. They can't seem to connect, for David to apologize, for Sammy to process what has happened. And that I also hoped would be something that readers would say, well, I would never do that. This is how I would handle it. So I was very much thinking about and hoping that That's What Friends Do would be a book that kids could read as a way to think about, how would they talk about this topic? Who would they talk with? How would they respond? You know, how would they handle a situation like Sammy and David find themselves in?
If I can jump in, Kathleen, your book specifically, I mean, I love it. I feel like the Me Too movement was happening, and all of, like, you know, the 12, 13-year-old, 14-year-old kids I knew or I was teaching, it was kind of, they were kind of hearing it, but they were more hearing like which celebrity was in trouble now. And that's all they were really taking away from it. They weren't taking away like the emotional aspect of it, or like, what would I do if I was in that situation? And I specifically remember last year book talking your book and asking them, what do you know about the Me Too movement? And they didn't really know anything except that it was a hashtag that people were using. And then when you start to break it down, and like, it was such a great gateway into a really difficult topic, that I feel like that's half the point of books, right? They're there to teach us something and to entertain us and make us feel something. And books that have heavy topics in them, or adult topics, are the perfect way. Like Janae Marks is another great example. My students didn't, from the desk of Zoe Washington, my students didn't really understand the Black Lives Matter movement. Granted, this was in the spring, this was before school closed last spring. And I feel like that book was a great introduction to these bigger topics. And I think middle grade is like so special when it comes to introducing heavy topics in ways that kids can kind of process and understand. And then if they're interested, like Kaela's work in progress, like if I were a kid, I would read that, and then I would go and I'd research every single thing about the environment as possible. Like, they're just great gateways into these kind of larger topics.
I thought Josh's book was a great gateway into these issues of history and what do we teach about history and what's remembered about history. which is not exactly the question I know that you had asked, Elizabeth, but I felt like that was one of the things I loved the most about it. Was it's an adventure story and a spooky story, but there are some really important big ideas that are being talked about in that book that I think kids, middle school kids can be ready for those topics. And it's a great way into those topics, more than their teacher sort of banging them over the head with facts or, information.
I think one of the things that I love about middle grade and middle grade readers is this willingness to go on the journey if it's a fantastical story. And I mean, as far as I know, no one who's read my book has actually discovered that they are a witch and have magical powers. But my hope is that it's that sort of exciting premise that brings you in. And just speaking from my own experience and looking at my kids, like no one likes to feel like they're being taught something or lectured at. But if you're enjoying a story, in the Witches of Willow Cove, it's a story about a boy and a girl who are best friends, and they have this sort of, it's not a Me Too moment, but they have a sort of a breakup to their friendship. And as these amazing events are happening and mysteries are being solved and powers are being discovered, they're also navigating what does it mean to be friends when you're 13 years old and one's a boy and one's a girl? And what are the elements that are most important in friendship? And I think if I had sat down to write a book that was about friendship, I think, and I know others can do a good job, but I think I would have written a really bad book. But I tried to write a book about in this exciting adventure and mystery, and these themes just emerged. And I think that's the beauty of middle grade, is that you can write something fantastical and still get at these things that are very helpful for children to read about and to process and to compare to their own experiences.
With Jennifer Strange, it's more of a footnote in the first book that she's bisexual. But over the course of the series, the entire theme of it is like through the metaphor of Jennifer having this hereditary power, this thing she is given, has no choice in being given by her family. It's basically her family expectations, right? Like that they have a certain idea of what she should and shouldn't be, what she should and shouldn't do. And through the course of this overall series, she's going to figure out, what do I want to do about that expectation? What do I want to do about being queer in this family with this prestigious history that I'm going to reveal in book 2. In book 1, it's very quick. It takes place over 3 days, and it's mostly Jennifer and Liz fighting every ghost coming out of the woodwork in Savannah, Georgia. But there are a couple things I laid the seeds of in the first book, like she realizes when she goes to her first school, she's attracted to Ashley, this new student who's very smart, brings her on board to this academic bowl to be a team together, and she's sort of realizing that, oh, I am attracted to women. Oh, that is part of my identity. What do I do about that? How does my family feel about that? And having grown up a closeted bisexual in the South, it was not always easy. And I wanted to use Jennifer's story to kind of talk about family expectations versus who are you? Who do you want to be? And can these two things coexist with each other? Can you heal that bond with your family? Can you form an identity that you don't break your family apart, but you can still become who you're meant to be, and they can learn who you are? And I am very excited about it because, like, it's been a long time that I've been able to give my voice to something. Like writing this, I was very much closeted before, so this book was kind of me coming out and like talking about it. And I want other kids to feel like when I was 14, 15, I was desperate for a book like this, where I could have had a girl who was on an adventure, like a girl with powers, because I was really into Sailor Moon and that sort of thing. And I would have loved to have, at the same time, she's tackling, what is my identity? What do I want to be? Who do I want to be? Whether that's accepted or not. So I'm very much hopeful that there'll be more queer horror, because that would be really great. Like, I would love that when I was that age. And I know there's a lot of readers looking for it now.
I will mention to our audience one more time that these books are available from Gibson's Bookstore. Kaela, I'm going to ask you this question first, and then everybody else jump in. Found families.
Oh, sure.
Such a common and crucial part of middle grade literature, and that's found family, meaning the family that you choose versus family of origin, or at least that's my definition of it. Kaela, can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. I think it definitely speaks to one of the most classic and enduring themes of middle grade, like going all the way back, is about going out on an adventure and making your way through these new relationships and new possibilities beyond, the way the people that you were necessarily raised with. And in my book, Ku has a kind of strange, very strange situation where she lives with a group of birds, and she's very much a feral child in the way. I drew on a lot of, initially for the idea, I drew on a lot of mythology and kind of in their many different cultural myths around children being raised by animals or somehow living outside of the regular human sphere. But she really has to make her way among humans and adjust, and she finds so many of the ways that we act very strange. So in her case, her found family is relatively small. By the end of the book, it's just her, Tully, and her upstairs neighbor, Aggie, who is a girl around her own age. But it's definitely, when I was a kid, the most exciting thing that I found in books beyond adventure or a sense of possibilities being expanded was the same idea that there are people out there that you can connect with that you aren't necessarily related to. And that's always a possibility. And I think it speaks sort of to what Lorien was talking about with hope. I think that feeling of finding your people, even ones that you aren't related to, it's definitely part of that hope equation. Everyone wants to be accepted and feel that they're surrounded by people who understand them, or if they don't understand them, at least give them the benefit of the doubt and be part of a community. So I think that's a big part of middle grade.
I guess I'll jump in. For me, I think at that age, in The Witches of Willow Cove, the characters are all 13 to begin with. And I think that is the age when your peer group begins to have a little more influence in your life, even than your actual family, or at least you're starting to see how others live and the values that others have, and you begin to kind of question, this is how I was raised, but this is how this person is raised, and how are those things different, and what feels right to me. And I think middle grade is a great place to explore those kinds of issues. In The Witches of Willow Cove, we have a coven of 6 girls that come together from very different backgrounds and very different values in some ways, and also different personalities. And it's sort of a misfit group in that it's not necessarily the families or the friend group that they would have chosen for themselves. But as they come together and they have to unite against sort of a common antagonist, they realize that they have sort of formed their own little family, and they are stronger together. And I was writing this. As I was writing this, I really felt that sense of that we needed to find our own tribe and sort of like unite. And I think middle grade has a great way of doing that, because the characters are at an age when they are starting to form these friend groups and question friendships that they had when they were younger, or reconnect and that sort of thing. So it's just a great period in kids' lives to be able to start to question and figure out what their friend group and what their sort of found family is like, what feels right to them.
So in That's What Friends Do, both Sammy and David have families, intact families of origin, but somewhat similar to what Kat said, both of them have to figure out who they are in the context of their family, and have to sort of communicate who they are. So they both end up connecting with their families in very different ways over the course of the story. And Sammy also finds a kind of family when she joins the girls' softball team. And she discovers that a group of girls, can be supportive and can be there to build her up rather than tear her down.
I'll go. I think in the Stitchers, Quinn has a good, strong group of friends. She has a good relationship with her mom, even though they're both like still grieving. She has a really amazing grandmother. She has a nice core kind of system, but her found family, I guess, would be Mike. He becomes the only person she ends up trusting with this secret, and trusting him enough to launch into this wild investigation. And they start to kind of form a bond, and this is like the first time in her life she starts to lie to her best friend Zoe about what she's doing, where she's going. She starts to keep secrets from her friend group, and that is incredibly common, I think, for this age group. I think Josh mentioned that there was like a falling out. I know in Kathleen's book, the friendship fallouts are kind of par for the course in middle school. And it's kind of when your friend group start to shift a little bit, you start to realize what your interests are instead of what you've been just doing out of habit, etc. And so, there's a lot of growing pains that I think come with friendships. And so Quinn has, this like strong family core, even though she's dearly missing her father. But, Mike would be, I guess her found family. It sounds kind of weird because she has a crush on him. So I was really hesitant to even say him. But I guess for the purpose of this question, I'll say Mike.
What I love about the relationship between the two of them in your book, Lorien, is that I don't think that she knows that she has a crush on him. And
yeah,
she
you're
certainly
right.
doesn't. She certainly doesn't know if he has a crush on her. And there's a lot of miscommunications that come out of that. Which I think is also sort of par for the course. And Kathleen, certainly in your story as well, there's a lot of miscommunication and misunderstandings. And that's another thing that's really, this is a great age range to explore those kinds of things, because that's when the people who are reading it are going to be experiencing those things, often for the first time as well.
You could write some fun, awkward scenes.
So we have a couple audience questions in our last few minutes here. Izza wants to know, when did you decide to become a writer? And Connor asks, how do you decide what stories are your priorities to tell? Josh,
Yes,
you or Kat? Josh or Kat? Rock, paper, scissors?
Go ahead, Kat.
Sure. So I'm trying to think of which one to tackle first. So I decided to be an author when I saw Stardust. I saw the movie Stardust, and I saw Septimus drown in a room full of air, and I thought, wow, I've never seen anything like that. And my college friend at the time looked at me and like, don't you know who Neil Gaiman is? I was like, no. And so I went and looked him up, and I was like, that's the job for me. That's what I want to do. It never occurred to me as an avid reader that I could also be the one to tell stories. And I decided that's really something I wanted to do. And as far as what stories I feel like are mine to tell, it's honestly both a mix of my own life experience, things I've been through, and subjects that interest me and genres that interest me. So Jennifer is an absolute metaphor for what I went through when I was in the 9th grade, and I was figuring out that I was bi. I got thrust into a new school. I couldn't figure out how to navigate my identity with what my family's expectations were, and it was very difficult. And I decided I wanted to write about that, but I also just love scary stories. I love them. I devour them. That's mostly what I read, middle grade YA adult. And I wanted to add to all of that conversation. I sort of look at it as other people put these things out into the universe, and I'm writing a letter back to them, based off of how they've inspired me. So I think as far as what I want to tell them, what I don't, it does, like, an idea that won't leave me alone, it doesn't go away. I end up just pursuing that, honestly.
So I was the kid and the adult who always had my head in a book, and my head in the clouds, and just sort of imagining. And I was always sort of a storyteller to myself, like, well, what if this happened? What if that happened? And I think I would say pretty much, from my first memory, I felt like, oh, someday I should write a book, and I want to write a book. And so I'm not sure that I ever decided that I was going to be a novelist, so much as I just sort of understood that someday I was going to try to do this. And I tried many times before I found the right one, the one that became The Witches of Willow Cove. And it's actually sort of a funny story about how you decide what you're going to write. I had written, before the first draft of The Witches of Willow Cove, I had written sort of my version of like Game of Thrones, that sort of thing. And I gave it to my wife to read, and very excited to see what she would say. And she was like, yeah, this isn't maybe you. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? She's like, well, you're kind of funny, you like adventure, you're kind of goofy, sometimes you're spooky, sometimes you like these sorts of things. She's like, why don't you write something more like that? Which was a very nice way of telling me that the manuscript that I had her read was terrible. So I sort of processed that, and I didn't know what I was going to write. I just sat down and I was like, all right, well, here's the first sentence, here's the next sentence. And I was like, darn it, she was right. Like, this is what I should be writing. Because it felt natural, and it felt so easy to write that first draft, because the story just suggested itself, and it was heavily influenced by my influences. I really like genre stories, the Buffy the Vampire Slayer, that kind of thing. But also, as you can see, like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, all those like 80s movies, Goonies, like all of that is sort of core to who I am. And it's like, well, stop trying to write something else and just write something that you would want to read. What I tried to do with The Witches of Willow Cove was not just write something that upper middle grade readers would like, but I wanted to be able to give it to someone, an adult, and be like, hey, I think this is a book you'll like. And it's the kind of thing that I like. It could be, I think, like, adults like to watch Stranger Things, which has middle school characters in it, and it's the same thing, I think, for Witches of Willow Cove. I was trying to write something that I would write, or that I would like to read, that I would like to watch, and also that kids would. So I think the story suggests itself in a lot of ways.
So I've been writing my whole life. I have an undergraduate degree in creative writing. I have a master's of fine arts in creative writing. It took me a very, 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 very long time to get up the courage to write a novel, because I was so afraid of failing. I was so afraid that I would write a novel and it would just go in the drawer and no one would ever see it, and I would feel like a failure. And it took me a long time, but I finally got to the point where I decided I would rather be a writer who failed than a writer who didn't try. So I had been teaching, and I very deliberately told my students, my last year of students, that I was going to be taking early retirement from teaching in order to be a writer, and that I was going to write a novel. And so I felt like I had to own it and be public about it. And then, much to my total surprise, I eventually became a writer who didn't fail. And but I really had to get to the point where I was like, I have to do this, even if on my gravestone it said she never published anything. And in terms of the ideas, for me, there's a voice. And once I have the voice, which can take a long time, so I'll have some sort of story idea that doesn't make a lot of sense, but when I can hone in on the narrator, on the main character or main characters, and on that voice, then I know that's the story I need to pursue.
I know we're about out of time, so I'll just say I was 6. I wanted to be a writer since I was 6, and I'm Kathleen, you're the sweetest. That just like almost made me cry that you were like, oh, like just want to give you a hug. But no, I was 6 and I'm annoying and relentless and just kept writing manuscripts and they just never went anywhere until the Stitchers. That's the long story short.
Mine is actually very similar, Lorien. I was actually a late reader and writer as a child, but my mom was very patient and she would sit there and write out the stories that I was dictating to her starting when I was 4 or 5. And I don't think I ever seriously considered anything else, which it took me until I was well into my 20s to realize that the rest of the world was not walking around. Everyone else wasn't also thinking all the time about books they wanted to write. But I had a lot of confidence issues, and it took me a long time, and I always thought I would be a writer and a doctor, but then I didn't realize that medical school was not going to be for me, or I would be a writer and a teacher or something. And I always was, yeah, I just, that's how it worked for me. And in terms of the stories that I think about writing, I'm still working through ideas that I got as a teenager. Like Coup was an idea that I got when I was a teenager, and my current book not as much, but my next book also is an idea that I got as a teenager. And I feel like that was the peak period for me of ideas, and I would be writing down all the time in little notebooks plot ideas. So yeah, anyone out there who wants to write and is younger, who's watching, write down all your ideas in a little notebook, because you may still want them in 15 or 20 years.
Definitely.
Those ideas might be the seed that grows into a different idea. You never know where your ideas are going to come from. That's about all the time that we have, unless each of you guys want to give everybody a very brief piece of advice for young writers out there. If you have like a 30-second or less piece of advice, what would you want to say to a young writer or yourself when you were first starting out?
I would say don't self-edit to the point of paralysis. That was what slowed me down, was wanting to get it right the first time instead of just plowing through and getting it on the page and then seeing what you have, because it's easier to edit something that's on the page than it is to edit a blank screen.
And I would say be the writer that you are, and don't try to be a different kind of writer. Don't compare yourself to other writers and say, well, I must not be a writer because I don't do X. Own your own process and your own passions and keep writing.
As a writer illustrator, I wish I had known that when I got stuck on what story I wanted to tell, I could also draw it out. You don't have to be a perfect artist. Sometimes the scene of what you want to say or what you think will happen next comes to you as you draw it out. Just free draw, free write, allow yourself to explore, because all these doodles that I used to do for Jennifer Strange when I couldn't figure out a scene are now in the book, and I have an illustrated book. So don't be afraid to explore lots of different kinds of mediums to tell your story and have fun.
I know how much to add. Get messy, make mistakes, have fun, because when it's not, if you're not having fun, then the reader's not going to have fun.
I feel like I gave my piece of advice. I guess the only other thing I would add to it is that I've seen how much humility helps when working with editors, and really being open to the idea that other people can have great ideas, and it's always worth it to get a second opinion. Not, it can be wrong too, but just to open yourself up to other people's ideas as you're working on things, or other people's critiques, and get a thick skin.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to the 5 of you for joining us. I will wave you guys out. Thank you so much for everybody joining us from home. Lorien Lawrence, Kat Scully, Cathleen Barnhart, Josh Roberts, and Kaela Noel. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Bye. Thank you.